Hello, welcome. I'm Ruth Darr, introducing at the last minute for someone else who unfortunately couldn't do it today. Welcome to the last lunch hour lecture of this term. And as you can all read on the screen, today we have Mike Parker Pearson from our Institute of Archaeology, who is going to unravel the mysteries of Stonehenge. Mike was inspector, he should know well, because he was inspector of monuments for English heritage from 1984 to 1990. And then he went to the Department of Archaeology at the University of Sheffield, where he stayed until 2012. And he is going to talk probably about his research interests, which are Stonehenge, its purpose and people, the Beaker people, and you're going to learn all about the Beaker people, I presume.
Sadly not.
Ah.
If you've come for the Beaker people...
Okay, well, you'll have to read the research in that case. And death and burial, funereal archaeology. And in 2010, he was named the Archaeologist of the Year. So we're indeed honored to have him with us today.
Thanks very much, thank you. Good afternoon. Now, I have 40 minutes to give you the results of 10 years of field research. And the clock is already ticking. We're already 2 minutes in, so it's actually 38 minutes. Let me just explain briefly how this all came about. I really wasn't going to be working at Stonehenge. As far as I was concerned, it was never part of my career game plan, whatever that might have been, because, of course, I was working in the Indian Ocean, in Madagascar, an island off the east coast of Africa. And it was there studying stone tombs and standing stones, very much a living tradition in parts of the island still today, that I met my colleague, a man called Ramilson, who was basically to change my destiny. Because in 1998, we were able to invite him to the UK, and of course, since he was not only an archaeologist, but from a family that put up standing stones, I thought he'd like to come and see Stonehenge. So when he asked, "Don't you know what it's for?" And I said, "No, it's one of the great mysteries of prehistory." He just looked at me like I was an idiot and said, "Have you learned nothing from working with me for the last decade? It was built for the ancestors. Because in Madagascar, we build in stone to commemorate the ancestors, whether it's monuments like standing stones, whether it's tombs." And it's a very simple kind of equation, because basically stone is permanent and wood is temporary. So this very simple little nugget of information was the spur to he and I rethinking how that Stonehenge landscape might have worked. Because for him just to put his finger on this important relationship, that the idea that, of course, things that were transient, everyday life, we will spend so much longer in the eternity of the afterworld. So, of course, his view was that, of course, you would be building in wood for the living. And we put together a simple model, a hypothesis, which placed Stonehenge not in isolation on the Salisbury Plain, but as actually one half of a much larger complex articulated by the River Avon. And slightly upstream, just 2 miles away, is the largest henge in Britain, the henge of Durrington Wolves. Outside of Durrington Wolves is Woodhenge, a timber circle that's been known about for a long time, and inside Durrington Wolves itself, 2 large timber circles were excavated in the 1960s. So we presented this quite simple model, but with it a series of predictions for what other archaeologists, as I thought, could go out and test. Would we actually be correct in assuming that Stonehenge was indeed in some way linked to the dead and to the ancestors, whereas the timber circles were somehow linked to the living? Our theory also required the existence of an avenue linking Durrington Wolves to the river in the same way that we knew there was an avenue linking Stonehenge to the river. And I thought there'd be other much more senior and important archaeologists than me to go out and see if this theory held up. I waited 4 years, nothing happened, and finally I realized that I was going to have to do it myself, so I got together a team from a variety of universities around the country, and together with all those students, as well as students from many countries across Europe, we launched a major 10-year offensive, which when it was running at its height, we were training 420 students in each field season. So at the end of this decade, we've trained over 1,000 students. And one of the great things about this is to see that those students who started 10 years ago are not only fully fledged professional archaeologists working in all aspects of archaeology, but they come back every year for their busman's holiday to supervise and teach the next batch. So I've been delighted with the kind of, the history of the project, as well as the archaeological results. In that time, we've excavated 42 different trenches within the World Heritage Site. The red squares mark where a good number of those were, not in the total. I'm going to have to be very circumspect today with the ones I tell you about, so we're not even going to mention the brand new henge of Bluestone henge that we discovered at the end of the avenue. Well, I just have, but that's it. Just to set the scene chronologically, we have, within this project, completely reassessed the chronological sequence for Stonehenge. So anything before basically 2 years ago is utterly out of date and wrong. We're now looking at a 5-stage sequence, of which the first 2 stages are the most important. Stages 3, 4, and 5 are relatively minor movings of stone, relocations of smaller stones. That first stage, though, we can now date through Bayesian statistical analysis of radiocarbon dates to quite a short period, somewhere around 2900 BC. And in that phase, that is when Stonehenge starts as a cremation cemetery. It's when we have a bank and a ditch dug around the main complex, and then within it and outside of it as well, a series of holes for both upright timbers and standing stones. And we think that the main installation is this ring of 56 pits, the so-called Aubrey holes, which we think held stones that have been brought all the way from Wales. They're known as bluestones, and I'll come back to those later. The second stage is when it really takes on the form broadly that we recognize it as today, in which those bluestones are relocated to within the center and are enclosed within a ring of much larger stones, whereas the bluestones weigh on average 2 tons each. These larger uprights of the local sarsen, a type of silcrete, a sandstone, these can weigh 20 tons or upwards. And at the center, you have a setting of 5 trilithons. So that's pairs with a lintel on top. Now, where we actually started with our project wasn't Stonehenge at all. It was at Durrington Wolves, this site up beside the River Avon to the northeast. And it was here that we were able to investigate not just the largest henge in Britain, but to discover that underneath it there were traces of what had once been a very large settlement, a settlement that appears to have covered an area of about 14 hectares. Such almost urban settlements are, well, not just extremely rare, this is the only one that we know of from this period in Northern Europe. And what we were able to show is that this whole business of hengification, so the settlement then being abandoned and destroyed, and this large enclosure built over the top of it, and I'll just warn you that what archaeologists call a henge is not what the general public consider a henge to be. For us, a henge is an earthen enclosure where the bank is on the outside of the ditch. So there's if you're trying to keep something in. And it is very confusing when I explain that according to this definition, Stonehenge itself is not a henge because the bank is on the inside. But we will gloss over these little niceties. The key thing I think to make about this is from having excavated here and on other henge sites, this business of enclosing special places is something that seems to happen after there's been something major at that location. In this particular case, it's effectively commemorating and marking off the fact that there was once a village, a large settlement aggregation on this site. The radiocarbon dates that we have from the settlement are broadly in a 45-year period or less, around 2500 BC. So that's 400 years after the first stage, and it coincides with the second stage, that Sarsen stage at Stonehenge. So we think that the two were indeed contemporary, the settlement with the construction of that main second stage, and my guess is that this would have served as the workers' camp to actually be resident in. And we've learnt a great deal from that settlement. First of all, of course, I mentioned these timber circles at this location, and the most impressive of these was the southern circle. Not a lot of people really know about it. It was excavated in the 60s when a road was blasted through the middle of the henge, and it's pretty much a timber facsimile in terms of its layout, but on a slightly different solstitial axis to Stonehenge. Whereas Stonehenge is aligned towards the midwinter solstice sunset, the southern circle is aligned towards the midwinter solstice sunrise. Coming out of the front of that southern circle, you encounter that avenue that Ramilson and I predicted. And this is one of our sections across that avenue. So it's broadly running down the line of the valley. It's utilizing a natural landform. So there, underneath the constructed rammed flint surface, there was a natural surface of flint which had accumulated in the bottom of this valley. So there's a sense that they're taking in this situation a natural feature and enculturing it, turning it into something cultural and social. It's very impressive. Just the surface itself is 15 meters across. If you add in the banks, it's 30 meters across. It's very monumental. It's a processional way. It's not just a footpath down to the river. And not only that, whereas the southern circle has a midwinter solstice sunrise orientation, this avenue is oriented not quite in the same direction, but when you look back up the hill, you're oriented in almost 180 degrees to where the sun sets on the horizon at the midsummer solstice. So what we actually have here is a kind of opposition to that famous solstitial axis at Stonehenge. Perhaps more exciting than that was what we really hadn't quite expected, was that on either sides of that avenue, and this is broadly the line of it coming down the valley, we had a whole series of house platforms. And you can see one of them nice and clearly here. There's another just starting to emerge under excavation. So these are the remains of ruined houses, and the white is basically the plaster, chalk plaster for the floors. And some of these floors had been replastered up to 7 or 8 times. If that was an annual event, it suggests that this might have been a settlement that lasted, say, no more than a decade, but that's really rather speculative. But for us, not only was it quite something to find these house remains, and of course all the debris from when they had been abandoned was still lying on those floors, but they were also surrounded by deep, rich, organic sediments, what we like to call in the trade midden. This is basically rubbish, waste, constituted by plenty of dark, gungy organic material. The kind of thing, if reconstituted, would have been pretty much knee-deep. It is now compressed to a layer about that thick, and packed full of pottery, flint tools, and especially animal bones. I'll come back to the animals now, but one of the great things about the animal bones was that, unlike the normal sort of prehistoric settlement assemblage, where bones have been split for marrow, that every ounce of nutrition has been extracted out of them, these are often discarded whole or in articulation. We had entire racks of ribs, for example. And this is something that's indicative of not just conspicuous waste, but the feasting that goes with that. So we're looking at a very special site where people are coming to gather in large numbers, and we have begun to get some idea of what numbers might have been involved and at what times of the year. The houses were very simple, wattle and daub structures, and of course their superstructures have entirely disappeared. However, there's been a team of volunteers working for English Heritage in advance of the new visitor centre opening on the 17th of December. And they've done some experimental archaeology reconstructing 3 of our houses. Unfortunately, where this was done outside Salisbury, they didn't have planning permission, so they've been torn down, and the poor old volunteers have got to do it all over again within the new visitor centre in the Stonehenge World Heritage Site in this coming spring. So let's hope it's a nice warm spring for them, not too horribly cold. Now, Peter Dunn, our project artist, this is one of his many reconstructions. And just to give you an impression of what we think the size and shape of that settlement would have looked like, from the density of houses in the areas we've excavated, from the evidence of that deep, thick, organic occupation layer at every point where anyone has put a hole into Durrington Wolves under the banks in the last century. We are looking at, if you extrapolate outwards, we're looking at about 1,000 houses in all within this location. And I think with a minimum of 4 or 5 people in each house, we could be looking at a population of about 5,000. And my guess is that they are there at certain times of the year to build Stonehenge, and having built it, they leave. So I think this idea that Stonehenge is some kind of long-term temple with priests in white cloaks hanging out to officiate is really rather a modern myth. We're looking at a society in the British Neolithic which we increasingly consider as one where the meaning is in the making, and having built it, people just move off, and they may come back as they did at Stonehenge, but centuries later to initiate another stage of remodeling. Now, where did they come from? And the problem with Durrington Wolves is, of course, it's a settlement. There are no burials there. So we can't apply the techniques that have been so successful with the Beaker people, who I'm not going to talk about, where we've been able to carry out strontium isotopic analysis to determine where they grew up. Because, of course, dental enamel absorbs the strontium from the food that you eat, and that takes up the values of the underlying bedrock. But what we can do is carry out this technique on animals. We have the results now for the cattle that were consumed at Durrington Wolves, and we can tell from the distribution of elements that these were brought in whole. So I think we can assume they're coming in on the hoof. Our results also show, from basically sampling at different intervals within the dental enamel, teeth are like trees. You have ring-like formations as the tooth itself is growing in the early periods of an animal's life. And what it's shown us is that these are coming pretty much straight to Durrington Wolves from wherever they've been bred. So this really argues against them being the product of trade, a sort of pattern we get rather later in the early Bronze Age, around 2000 BC, from a number of burial sites in southern England. So we think this is basically procurement. animals coming in on the hoof, no doubt with people leading them, and quite possibly these can give us a proxy for where the people themselves are coming from to take part in building Stonehenge in its second stage. Now, you'd expect there to be not many food miles involved here, and quite possibly all of those cows coming from the neighbouring and underlying chalk downlands of Wessex. So on our map, that's basically the blue stuff. But what Sarah Viner and Jane Evans have established from the isotopic study is that actually that is just a minority amongst the sample of 75 that we have. There's just that tiny number within that particular band between 709 and 0.708. From slightly further away, within that green stuff, my isotope specialist colleagues call this the isotope value of doom, because most of Britain is covered in these Mesozoic deposits marked here in green. And again, that means that the cattle didn't have to have come anywhere further than 20 miles away, but of course, amongst there, that's just the nearest possible. They could have come from much, much further away, but we can only be certain that they're coming from at least 20 miles away. It gets a bit more interesting when we look at this large group, because actually there are only two very likely locations. One of them is the southwest. The other is somewhere up in the Lake District area. Coming from a similar distance, just a couple in this instance, from Silurian or Devonian geologies. So Wales, South Wales is a possibility, West Wales, or North Devon. And then we have this particular group here. And this has been the real eye-opener, because these have values that are broadly not found south of Scotland. We suspect that rather than coming, say, from the gneiss of beyond the Great Glen, it's more likely that these have come from Aberdeenshire, an area that was densely inhabited during this period. But what it means is that we're looking at animals being moved over 500 miles. It may sound an awful lot to us, but I'm very used to that kind of distance, seeing that happening in Madagascar, where they think nothing of moving huge trains on foot of cattle, 150 at a time, 10 men with guns and spears, and you make the 2-month journey on the way up there. So I think we're now having to understand two things, that not only are they capable of moving stock long distances across Britain, but this is way more than is actually necessary for the building of Stonehenge. Because I think the whole thing this is helping to show us is that the construction is something that lots of groups from different parts of the island, widely dispersed, wanted to be involved in that event. So I think it tells us something really important about Stonehenge in terms of its unifying purposes. Now, we're starting to do this work with the pigs. Richard Madgwick has produced some preliminary results, and what he's found from his pilot study is we're getting similar isotopic values, including extreme ones like those for the Scottish cattle. It's much harder to herd pigs. Richard's found out that the best way to do it is you just tie one to a cow and off they go. We know that in particular there are barbecues, they're eating a lot of boiled pork as well, and this is not just from the animal bones. This is also the work that Oliver Craig and his team have been doing on the lipids, the fatty acid residues within the pots themselves. But it's perhaps some of the most interesting work is that done by Umberto Albarella and Liz Wright, looking at the seasonality of the pig culling. Because it's not something that is happening throughout the year. There is very much a periodicity. So that what we can see is that in the pigs' first autumn and especially their first winter, that's the moment when the majority of them are being killed. Now, Umberto and Liz have also noticed that there is a very slight presence of culling going on throughout the pigs' first year and a half, and first 2 years. And what they suspect is that there may well have been a background presence of people at Durrington Wolves, a kind of caretaker community, which has then swelled for these winter feasting rituals. And it is presumably in that winter period, after the autumn harvest, before the spring sowing, that people are making their way within this very short time period, possibly no more than a decade, to actually take part in the whole business. Well, I said we didn't have any burials at Durrington Wolves. We don't. But somebody spilled a tooth on that avenue. And we've been able to examine this tooth isotopically. And where does it come from? From the Devonian and Silurian. So again, it's very likely that this individual came from South or West Wales, or perhaps slightly less likely, North Devon. And this, of course, points us in quite an interesting direction because, as you know, some of those bluestones, perhaps, well, the vast majority, have come from West Wales. More about that in a moment. Let's actually look at where we really have remains of the dead, and that is Stonehenge, because it's here that we have some 63 burials. We estimate that they're only a half, if not a third, or even a quarter of the likely total. It's basically the largest cemetery in the whole of Britain in the 3rd millennium. Many of the burials were actually dug up in the 1920s, and they were put into a hole within the site in 1935. We've re-excavated them. We're currently analyzing them. We have a first suite of radiocarbon dates, which shows us that they're actually forming a cemetery that lasted around 500 years, from somewhere around the very beginning of the monument, 2,900, if not slightly earlier. And then after something of a boom around 2009, 2,800, numbers drop off. So, and then ultimately probably going out of use as a burial ground sometime shortly after 2,500, shortly after that second phase is constructed. I'm just going now to answer or ask a simple question: why is Stonehenge where it is? And we suspect that we may have stumbled on this, the answer to this in 2008 when we excavated along the avenue. And as you know, this alignment, so looking towards the center of Stonehenge down that avenue, is focusing you towards midwinter solstice sunset. So this is the key alignment in that monument complex. If you turn around and look the other way, you're looking towards midsummer solstice sunrise. But I think we can be fairly sure from the remains of the pigs, their seasonality, that people probably weren't gathering here at the summer solstice, as everybody does today. If they were gathering, it's in the midwinter time. Sorry. Now, what our geomorphologists noticed when we opened up this trench, and you can see the two ditches of this solstice-aligned avenue running in our trench there and there, and it was what was in between them, because we had a series of trenches which I was sure had to be artificial because they were aligned on this solstice axis. So imagine my surprise when it turned out that they are natural. They are periglacial fissures, and they are set between two chalk ridges, or flutes in geomorphological parlance, which are also themselves periglacial geomorphological features. So we're actually looking at the cultural enhancement of an already existing natural landform. And we've been able to basically map this through geophysics and earthwork survey for a distance of some 150 meters coming out of Stonehenge. Just in August, this August, the largest excavation was carried out in Stonehenge within the last 80 years. You probably never heard about it because it was a contract job carried out for English Heritage in relative secrecy. Well, not very well advertised, I'm afraid. But what they did do was simply take off the tarmac, and underneath they found not only the ditches of the avenue, but to our geomorphologist's delight and relief, here are those periglacial fissures, and they are not on the outsides, as they had indeed predicted. So we're exceptionally pleased about that, because that really confirms this idea that just like the avenue that leads from the river to Durrington Wolves, here's another embellishment of an existing feature. I won't go into it, but close to the avenue, under what was the old car park, there are the remains of holes that held posts of pine that were 1 meter in diameter. Their radiocarbon dates put them at almost 10,000 years old. So we're wondering if this was actually a long-term gathering place with a major campsite down by the river near the Iron Age hill fort, below the Iron Age hill fort of Vespasian's camp. And so it raises all sorts of interesting ideas about whether they saw this as a long-term central place, a kind of axis mundi, a center of the world. Furthermore, this is becoming something of a common feature that we're recognizing in a whole variety of monument complexes all over Britain from this period. The use of natural features because of their concordance with movements of the sun or the moon or both. And this is another case where there are major excavations being conducted at the Ness of Brodgar, a settlement within this peninsula, which is itself aligned on the midwinter solstice sunrise. And in fact, if you stand in the Ness of Brodgar on the midwinter solstice and you watch the sun set, it sets in this notch between those two mountains on the adjacent island of Hoy. Now, why are they bringing some of their stones, admittedly the small 2-tonners, all the way from Wales, when the majority of them are coming from a mere 20 kilometres away to the north on the Marlborough Downs? That, of course, is the Sarsens. What is it about those bluestones? And I think, having learned what we have about the nature of Neolithic religion in Britain, it's nothing to do with worshipping the sun or the moon or the earth. It's actually to do with the specialness of certain places where they seem to have seen natural features as in some sense being miraculous, condensing relations between the heavens and the earth. So it's a religion of place that we're learning, not a religion to do with abstract or very real concepts such as sun and moon and earth and so on. So why is Wales so special? And this is really the aspect of the project that we're putting most effort into at the moment, because thanks to our geologists, we've identified at Craig Rosavellin a potential quarry for the bluestones. And there it is. We've had 3 seasons of excavation. And first of all, you'll notice that within it, we actually have a megalith prepared and ready to go. The reason it was left, we suspect, is because this is a splinter that has become detached from its base. So it appears to have actually broken, and perhaps that's the reason they just gave up on the job. But rather better than that, our geologists have been able to pinpoint with accuracy of down to 1 meter of where one of the rhyolites from the Stonehenge bluestones has a perfect match within this particular outcrop. And it's a fantastic piece of work by Richard Bevins and Rob Ixer. They deserve a medal. They worked this out 3 years ago, and they said basically there is the point that matches. And right there is indeed a recess where a pillar has been removed. Now, we're still very much working on this. We don't have a date for the quarry. I sent the radiocarbon samples in this morning. So I'm hoping that sometime next year, we're going to be able to tell you for sure that this is not only a Stonehenge quarry, but exactly when those stones were being extracted. Now, up until last week, it was generally believed that the other main type of stone, Stonehenge Bluestone, the spotted dolerites, had come from a variety of outcrops on the top of the Preseli Mountains, particularly one known as Carn Menin or Carn Miney. And again, Richard and Rob have stunned everybody by publishing last week their new analysis, which shows that these are the Bluestone sources. Archaeologists have been looking and investigating and excavating at Carn Miney pretty much ever since that source was first mistakenly identified in 1923. So we, however, have been fortunate to be looking in the other direction on the north side. And the sources that they do identify at Carn Goedog and Cerrig Mahoghian, they are at the top of a stream that runs down past the rhyolite quarry and then meets the River Nevern. The importance of this relocation, even though it is only a matter of a couple of kilometers, is extreme, because what it tells us is that that northerly focus, first of all, takes us away from any outdated ideas that those stones went southwards from Preseli to be floated at Milford Haven on rafts around the coast towards Stonehenge. They have to have gone a different route. But more importantly, it's focusing us on the possibility that there is something much more important further down that stream. And at the junction where it meets the Nevern River, up on a very prominent hilltop, is Castell Mawr. And our guess is that this particular site, and we've carried out just 2 preliminary seasons of investigation, our view is that not only is this a multi-period site from the Iron Age back in time to the Neolithic, one which is potentially a ceremonial center, my guess is that this is going to be where the first Stonehenge was put up. So we will be looking for the remains of the sockets for such bluestones as were at some point taken down and moved from Wales to Stonehenge. If we're right, I think this is really all about not those bluestones being important in their own right, but it's the monument that is being moved, effectively refounded at another center of the world. So we're seeing, again, another aspect of the role of Stonehenge in unification, bringing 2 separate polities, whatever they may be, into one. So at a point when we're seeing major changes in British prehistory from regional styles of architecture and portable material culture to styles that actually are found throughout the whole of the island of Britain. So I'll end there, and please do thank the fantastic team that have worked so hard on this project. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mike, for a fascinating lecture. We do have time for just one question, I'm afraid, before we have to go. So this gentleman here, you can wait for the microphone, sir.
Do you have any new thoughts as to how they got the massive stones from Wales to Stonehenge?
Oh, I've got my mic. Yeah. Excellent question, because we've always assumed that you put them on a sledge and you roll them, and maybe you have rollers, maybe you have sort of planks that you can put lengthways, put water on them, and then slide the sledge across them. And that was, pretty much what I was reasonably happy with until last week, when a colleague of mine, a professor of Iron Age archaeology from Deccan College in India, who's an expert on Indian megalithic burial sites, just popped by into my office to say, hi, how are you doing? And I couldn't resist showing him what we had. And he said, well, how heavy are these stones? I said, 2 tons. And he just snorted. And he said, that's nothing. They carried them. And I said, what? And he said, yes. You take a long pillar of stone like that, you insert a series of poles underneath at close intervals. You then get a gang of 50 taking up their position, 3 or 4 on either side of each pole. So each pole you've got 6 or 8 people, and you lift. And each one is carrying less than 50 kilos, and you walk. And when you get tired, you put it down, and you find another 50 people, and they pick it up, and they walk. Because if you try and roll these stones on sledges, that kind of distance, he said, they will break. However, you try to find shock-absorbent material to sit them on their sledges. And I thought, good grief. No one, and I get millions of emails on such topics, no one has ever suggested such a simple and easy solution. So,
Thank you, Mike.